Alright, let's go. Number 12. Sanai Maruyama. In 1992, archaeologists in Aomori Prefecture, northern Japan, began surveying land intended for a new baseball stadium. The ground did not yield the empty construction site planners expected. It yielded post holes, storage pits, graves, pottery, tools, and the accumulated evidence of a community that had occupied the terrace for centuries. The stadium project was eventually cancelled. In its place, Japan preserved one of the most revealing settlements of the Jomon world. Sanai Maruyama was used mainly between roughly 3900 and 2200 BCE, though the precise phases are described differently in different chronological systems. It stood near an inland bay surrounded by forests rich in chestnuts, walnuts, fish, game, and plant foods. This was not a farming city in the later Mesopotamian sense. Its people relied heavily on hunting, fishing, gathering, plant management, and storage. Yet they did not simply wander through the landscape, leaving temporary camps behind. They built pit dwellings, long structures, raised storehouses, roads, burial zones, and repeated arrangements that reveal an enduring social geography. The most famous reconstruction rises on 6 massive wooden posts. The original timber is gone, but the post holes remained, some containing enough surviving chestnut wood to reveal their scale. Archaeologists still debate the height and exact function of the building. It may have been a tower, platform, working structure, or ceremonial landmark. What matters is what the foundations prove. People coordinated labor, selected enormous trees, moved them, and rebuilt major structures in planned locations. Material from distant regions arrived at the settlement. Jade, obsidian, amber, and other non-local goods show that northern Japan was connected through exchange networks rather than isolated in a forest. Storage allowed food to outlast a season. Lacquerware, baskets, bone tools, figurines, and elaborate pottery show skilled traditions whose fragile parts rarely survive. The site also contained adult burials, infant jar burials, and large refuse mounds that became archives of ordinary life. Sanai Maruyama matters because it breaks a simplistic equation. Agriculture does not automatically produce settled complexity, and hunting and gathering do not automatically prevent it. A rich ecosystem, managed resources, exchange, storage, and collective memory could support a large, organized community without kings riding or fields of grain stretching to the horizon. Its ending is less dramatic than a conquest. Occupation declined, and the settlement was eventually left behind. Environmental change may have affected available resources, but no single explanation has been proved. The people did not vanish from Japan. Jomon communities continued elsewhere. What disappeared was this particular arrangement of houses, paths, storage, and gathering places. Beneath the proposed stadium, the dark circles of vanished posts preserve the outline of a society built largely from wood. Number 11. Jiahu. In the Huai River region of Henan Province, China, excavations at Jiahu uncovered an early Neolithic settlement occupied during the 7th millennium BCE. The village belonged to a world before Chinese dynasties, bronze inscriptions, and royal capitals. Yet among its graves and houses were objects capable of carrying sound across 9,000 years. The most extraordinary were flutes made from the wing bones of cranes. Several survived complete enough to be played. They were not random tubes that happened to whistle. Their carefully placed holes produced organized pitches, and different instruments show experimentation across time. The discovery transformed an abstraction, prehistoric music, into something physical. Breath could once again pass through the same polished bone and produce tones heard by the people of Jiahu. Music was only one part of the settlement. Jiahu contained houses, storage pits, burials, pottery, stone tools, and evidence connected with rice use. Chemical analysis of residues absorbed into pottery identified a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. That result did not reveal a written recipe, but it did reveal controlled transformation. People combined ingredients, allowed microbes to act, and created a drink likely tied to food, hospitality, or ceremony. Marks carved on tortoise shells, bone, and pottery have become one of Jiahu's greatest temptations. Some resemble forms that appear much later in Chinese writing. It is reasonable to call them signs or symbols. It is not established that they formed a writing system, or that a continuous line connects each mark directly to Shang oracle bone script thousands of years later. The honest mystery is already powerful. People selected objects, placed deliberate marks upon them, and deposited some in socially meaningful contexts, but the grammar, if there ever was one, has not survived. Burials show differences in grave goods. Certain individuals were interred with flutes, tools, or ornaments, suggesting that identity and status mattered. But Jiahu was not a literate state with bureaucrats and armies. It was a farming and foraging community whose complexity appears through repeated practice rather than royal monuments. Rice cultivation was developing, while hunting, fishing, and gathering still contributed to survival. The settlement was eventually abandoned, possibly after flooding and environmental pressure, though its conclusion should not be reduced to one cinematic disaster. Its people belonged to broader populations and traditions that continued beyond the site. Jiahu's legacy is not that it secretly possessed modern musical theory or invented Chinese writing in finished form. Its legacy is more intimate. Long before a scribe recorded a song, people tuned bone, brewed grain and fruit, marked shell, and buried meaningful objects with the dead. Number 10. The Maltese Temple Builders. Across the islands of Malta and Gozo stand chambers assembled from stones so large that later generations imagined giants had raised them. The name Gigantesia itself preserves that association. Archaeology offers a more human and more impressive explanation. Between roughly 3600 and 2500 BCE, island communities developed a long-lived tradition of constructing megalithic ceremonial buildings, without metal cranes, wheeled construction machinery, or a written architectural plan. The surviving complexes include Gigantia, Chajar Kim, Mnadra, Tarshian, Ta'adrat, and Skorba. They are not copies of a single blueprint. Builders altered layouts across centuries, producing curved chambers, monumental entrances, paved passages, altars, decorated blocks, and carefully shaped facades. Coralline limestone was used where durability mattered. Softer Globigerina limestone could be carved more easily. Quarrying, transport, dressing, and placement required knowledge shared through training and performance rather than texts. The word temple is conventional, supported by the building's unusual plans and ritual material, but their exact ceremonies remain unknown. Figurines, animal remains, carved spirals, altars, and internal spaces suggest communal rites and offerings. They do not prove a single mother goddess religion, a priestly monarchy, or one unified island state. The people who gathered here may have belonged to multiple communities connected by marriage exchange, ancestry, and shared ritual obligations. Their achievement becomes clearer when the islands are treated as ecosystems rather than blank stages. Timber, soil, water, and productive land were limited. Every large construction project competed with daily subsistence. Stone did not move itself, but neither do we need lost technology to explain it. Levers, rollers or sledges, ropes, prepared surfaces, repeated experiments, and large groups can accomplish astonishing work. Small stone spheres found at some sites have inspired transport theories, but no single method explains every building phase. Some temples also engage with light and horizon. At Mnadra, sunlight reaches particular architectural points near the solstices and equinoxes. This demonstrates observation and orientation, not an all-purpose prehistoric observatory whose every stone encodes hidden mathematics. The builders lived with seasonal skies because sailing, planting, food storage, and ceremony all made time visible. By about 2500 BCE, the temple building tradition ended. Environmental stress, social change, and resource pressure have all been proposed, but the evidence does not identify one final event. Later Bronze Age communities used the islands differently. The temple culture did not leave us its name, language, or explanation for the carved spirals. It left doorways opening into roofless chambers, where the Mediterranean sun still moves across stones positioned more than 5,000 years ago. Number 9. Varna. In 1972, construction work near Varna on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast exposed ancient graves. Archaeological excavation revealed a Copper Age cemetery dating broadly to the later 5th millennium BCE. Inside were human burials, symbolic graves without bodies, copper tools, stone objects, shell ornaments, and thousands of pieces of worked gold. The cemetery became famous for containing one of the earliest large concentrations of gold objects known anywhere. The gold is visually irresistible, but its distribution matters more than its shine. Some graves contained little. A small number contained extraordinary wealth. Grave 43 held an older adult male accompanied by gold ornaments, copper objects, stone tools, and symbols of status. Other richly furnished graves were cenotaphs, burials with no human body, showing that ritual identity could be represented even in absence. The cemetery turned social differences into a permanent landscape. Gold was not useful for cutting wood or harvesting crops. It was soft, bright, rare, and transformable. Its value had to be created socially. Mining, hammering, shaping, exchange, and ceremonial display connected specialists with leaders, families, and distant sources. Copper metallurgy and access to salt, shell, stone, and other materials placed the communities around Varna within networks spanning the Balkans and the Black Sea. This does not automatically make Varna a kingdom. No palace archive identifies why is the person in grave 43 as a king, prince, or high priest. The cemetery served communities associated with the Varna culture, not a named empire with known borders. Yet the contrast among graves provides unusually direct evidence of hierarchy. By this time, some individuals or roles commanded far more symbolic wealth than others. Inequality was no longer merely inferred from house size. It was wrapped around bodies and placed beside the dead. The discovery also corrected a long habit of imagining prehistoric Europe as a peripheral world waiting for civilization to arrive from Egypt or Mesopotamia. Balkan communities experimented with metallurgy, farming, trade, and social organization on their own historical path. Their achievements did not require a mysterious vanished race. They emerged from local knowledge linked across broad networks. The societies associated with Varna changed profoundly after the cemetery's main period. Climate shifts, settlement reorganization, conflict, migration, and exchange with steppe populations are parts of a complex regional story, not one proven invasion scene. The gold survived because it did not rust and because mourners placed it beyond everyday reach. 6,000 years later, those unequal graves still record the moment when brightness became authority. Number 8. Vinča. Along the Danube and its tributaries, across parts of present-day Serbia and neighboring regions, communities associated with the Vinča culture flourished during the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. The type site at Vincebello Brdo accumulated layer upon layer of occupation, creating a tell that preserved rebuilding, craft, exchange, and domestic life over many generations. Vinča settlements could be substantial. Houses were constructed from timber frames, woven material and clay, then renewed or replaced as communities changed. Pottery, figurines, polished stone tools, ornaments, and evidence of long-distance exchange reveal skilled production. Obsidian and marine shell moved far from their sources. Most strikingly, early copper working in the Balkans shows that metal experimentation began long before the Bronze Age states usually associated with metallurgy. Then there are the signs. Short incisions appear on pottery, figurines, spindle whorls, and other objects. Some repeat. Some are simple crosses, lines, chevrons, or more complex forms. They are often called the Vinča symbols, and they have inspired claims that Europe possessed writing thousands of years before Mesopotamia. That claim goes beyond the evidence. No long text, grammatical sequence, bilingual inscription, or clearly linguistic archive has been found. The signs may have marked owners, makers, quantities, ritual categories, clans, or ideas. Some may be decorative. Calling them proto-writing is possible only as a cautious hypothesis, not a settled identification. Their real importance lies in the repeated use of visual codes within communities that had no preserved script. Vinča figurines create a similar trap. Their stylized faces and bodies look strangely modern to contemporary eyes, but resemblance is not evidence of masks, aliens, or forgotten machinery. Archaeologists study where the figurines were found, how they were broken, and which features were emphasized. They may have participated in domestic ritual, identity, teaching, memory, or play. Without words, no single explanation can claim them all. Around the later 5th millennium BCE, major Vinča settlements declined or were reorganized. The reasons varied by region and may include economic change, shifting networks, local conflict, and new population movements. The culture did not disappear in a single night, and its people were not erased from Europe. Archaeological labels end more cleanly than human lives do. What remains at Belo Brado is a mound made from repetition, floors laid over floors, walls raised over walls, signs cut into clay that was then fired and broken. They are not a lost alphabet waiting for an easy translation. They are evidence that prehistoric people surrounded themselves with symbols long before Europe produced a readable, written history. Number 7. Cucuteni Trypillia. From the Carpathians toward the Dnipro, communities of the Cucuteni Trypillia archaeological culture occupied parts of present-day Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine from approximately the late 6th to the early 3rd millennium BCE. They produced painted pottery whose spirals and geometric forms remain instantly recognizable. But the greatest surprise was not found on a decorated vessel. It appeared when surveys revealed the scale of entire settlements. At sites such as Maidanetsky, Talyanki, and Nebelivka, houses were arranged in concentric rings across hundreds of hectares. Geophysical survey allowed archaeologists to map thousands of structures without excavating every wall. In the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, these places became some of the largest known settlement aggregations in the world. Calling them cities is debated. Population estimates vary dramatically because not every mapped house was necessarily occupied at the same time. Some researchers see permanent large communities. Others propose seasonal assembly centers, pilgrimage-like gatherings, or settlements with changing levels of occupation. Recent work increasingly treats them as experiments in large-scale social organization, rather than forcing them into the model of a dense Mesopotamian city. That distinction makes the story more interesting. The plans contain neighborhoods, assembly buildings, open spaces, kilns, and carefully repeated rings. Communities coordinated construction across a scale visible from the air, yet evidence for palaces, royal tombs, and centralized coercion is limited. Some analyses suggest that large public or assembly structures helped integrate groups, while household differences remained comparatively restrained. Complexity did not have to begin with a king standing above everyone else. Food production was equally organized. Farming, herding, manuring, crop selection, woodland use, and movement of resources supported large gatherings of people and animals. Painted ceramics and figurines carried shared styles across enormous distances. Copper, flint, salt, and other goods linked local communities to broader exchange. Many Trypillia houses were intensely burned. The repeated pattern has encouraged images of invasion or ritual destruction. Experiments and archaeological studies show that some buildings may have been deliberately burned at the end of their use, though motives probably differed, and not every fire was ceremonial. A burning house could mark closure, renewal, accident, violence, or several processes at once. There is no evidence that every settlement was destroyed by one enemy. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the megasite system had ended as populations and economies reorganized amid environmental and demographic change. Yet its brief florescence challenges one of archaeology's deepest assumptions. Thousands of people could assemble in planned landscapes without leaving the familiar signatures of a state. Beneath Ukrainian fields, magnetic traces still reveal circles of houses from a civilization that may have been urban, seasonal, or something for which modern language has no perfect word. Number 6. Nabta Playa. Today, the western desert near Egypt's southern border appears hostile to permanent life. In the early Holocene, the landscape was different. Seasonal monsoon rains reached farther north, filling shallow basins and supporting grasslands, animals, and human communities. Nabta Playa was one of those basins. Its archaeology preserves repeated visits, settlement, wells, cattle-centered ritual, stone arrangements, and the long transformation of a place as the Sahara moved between moisture and aridity. Human activity in the region extends back many millennia, but Nabta became especially significant during the Neolithic. People dug deep wells that helped extend their stays beyond the brief wet season. They built huts, made pottery, gathered wild plants, and eventually incorporated domesticated sheep and goats. The history of cattle at Nabta is more disputed. Some researchers argued for very early African cattle domestication, while others interpret the earliest bones as hunted wild cattle. The secure point is that cattle later became central to pastoral life and ritual. Stone features turned the basin into a landscape of memory. These include alignments, tumuli, large slabs, and a small stone circle sometimes described as a calendar. Certain orientations may relate to the summer solstice or seasonal skies, which would have mattered because the return of rain governed movement and survival. But the popular phrase "world's oldest astronomical observatory" promises more than the stones can securely deliver. Nabta was not an observatory in the modern institutional sense, and not every alignment has a proven celestial target. Its deeper importance is social. Researchers have interpreted Nabta as a regional ceremonial center where mobile pastoral groups gathered, renewed alliances, conducted rituals, and shared a common identity. Monument building made an otherwise seasonal landscape durable. Stones remained when people and herds moved away. Burials of cattle, large megalithic constructions, and repeated gathering points suggest that animals were not merely calories. They were woven into ideas about ancestry, obligation, status, and the sacred. Nabta is sometimes presented as a direct blueprint for pharaonic Egypt. The chronology invites comparison, and northeastern African pastoral traditions certainly belong to the wider background from which Nile societies later emerged. But a straight line from one stone circle to Egyptian astronomy, kingship, or religion is not established. Cultural history is usually a network of contacts and transformations, not a single seed growing unchanged for thousands of years. As the African humid period weakened, the desert became less forgiving. Groups increasingly concentrated near dependable water, including the Nile Valley. Nabta's basin dried, and the gatherings ended. That environmental shift did not erase a fully formed desert empire. It closed a ceremonial landscape built by pastoral communities, whose complexity was expressed through movement rather than city walls. In the sand, stones still point toward horizons once watched for clouds. Number 5. Çatalhöyük. In 1958, archaeologist James Mellart identified a large mound on the Konya plain of central Anatolia. Excavations beginning in the 1960s, followed decades later by a long international research project, revealed one of the most densely occupied Neolithic settlements known. Çatalhöyük was inhabited for many centuries, beginning around 7400 BCE, when the plain contained wetlands, reeds, water birds, fields, and grazing animals. The settlement did not resemble a later city with avenues, plazas, palace walls, and segregated districts. Houses were packed directly against one another. People moved across roofs and entered rooms through openings above, descending ladders into plastered interiors. Smoke escaped through the same upper zone. The roofscape was street, work platform, route, and social boundary all at once. Inside, repeated plastering kept walls and floors bright. Platforms served as sleeping, working, and burial places. The dead were buried beneath house floors, sometimes long after flesh had disappeared from the bones. Bull horns, animal installations, reliefs, paintings, and carefully treated human remains show that domestic life and ritual were not separate categories. A house could be kitchen, workshop, tomb, archive, and sacred space. Çatalhöyük has carried many modern fantasies. An early emphasis on female figurines helped create the image of a peaceful mother goddess city ruled by women. Later excavations found figurines in varied contexts and showed that the evidence cannot support such a simple religious system. The settlement has also been called completely egalitarian. Households shared many features, and no obvious palace dominates the mound, but differences accumulated through burial, memory, access to objects, and the histories of particular houses. Equality and hierarchy were negotiated rather than absent. The community farmed cereals and legumes, herded sheep and goats, hunted wild cattle and other animals, gathered wetland resources, and exchanged obsidian from Cappadocian sources. Daily life was physically demanding. Crowded houses, indoor smoke, infectious disease, injuries, and repeated contact with animals created costs alongside the benefits of settled life. Human skeletons and house deposits reveal civilization not as a triumphal invention, but as an experiment with consequences. The famous wall image, sometimes called the world's first map, may depict a settlement beneath the twin peaks of Hassan Da'a, or it may show a leopard skin and geometric pattern. The evidence does not settle the argument. Çatalhöyük offers many such boundaries: town or oversized village, shrine or decorated house, map or animal skin. Occupation shifted and eventually contracted toward the West Mound before the settlement was abandoned. There is no single proven catastrophe. The landscape, economy, and community changed over generations. What remains is a mound created by households rebuilding almost the same spaces, living above their ancestors until architecture itself became memory. Number 4. Ain Ghazal. In the 1970s, road construction on the outskirts of Amman, Jordan, cut through an archaeological site. Excavations began in the following decade, revealing a major Neolithic settlement called Ain Ghazal, the Spring of the Gazelle. Its long occupation began in the 9th millennium BCE and continued through major changes in farming, herding, architecture, and ritual. At its greatest extent, Ain Ghazal covered perhaps 10 to 15 hectares, making it unusually large for its time. Population figures are models rather than census records, and estimates depend on how much of the site was occupied simultaneously. Even cautious reconstructions, however, reveal a substantial community of rectangular houses, plastered interiors, courtyards, storage, and working spaces. Residents cultivated crops, raised animals, hunted, and maintained connections across the southern Levant. The discovery that made the site famous came from pits beneath abandoned buildings. Archaeologists found two groups of human-shaped figures made with plaster over reed or stick cores. Some are full statues, others busts. Their broad heads, narrow bodies, and enormous outlined eyes confront the viewer with an expression that seems both human and unreachable. Several have two heads, none carries a written name. The figures were intentionally made, used for an unknown period, then carefully buried. Their fragility makes their survival extraordinary. They may represent ancestors, spirits, mythical beings, ritual participants, or social identities, but no interpretation can be confirmed. Calling them gods is possible only as speculation. Their careful deposition does prove that the community invested enormous labor in images that were not ordinary household tools. Other practices complicate the picture. Some human skulls were removed and treated, echoing wider traditions of ancestor-focused ritual in the Neolithic Near East. Animal and human figurines appeared in different contexts. Houses were repaired and replastered. The dead, the represented body, and the continuity of domestic space seem to have been deeply connected. Ain Ghazal also records the ecological cost of growth. Herding, fuel collection, cultivation, and construction placed pressure on nearby woodlands and soils. As environmental conditions and regional economies changed, the settlement contracted. Older accounts sometimes describe a sudden ecological collapse, but current interpretation is cautious. Population, land use, climate, and mobility interacted across centuries. This was not a capital ruled by a documented dynasty. It was a large farming settlement whose people coordinated ritual and social life before pottery became common in the region. Its statues are not portraits in the modern sense. They are hollow bodies built around reeds, hidden beneath floors, and recovered beside a modern highway. The first faces in the countdown that seem to stare back. Number 3. Jericho. At Tel es Sultan, northwest of modern Jericho, archaeological deposits rise beside the perennial spring of Ain es Sultan. Human activity at the mound reaches back toward the end of the last ice age. By the 9th to 8th millennia BCE, a permanent Neolithic settlement had developed with substantial architecture, including a stone wall, ditch, and a massive tower. The tower is approximately 8 meters high and contains an internal stone staircase. Its construction demanded quarrying, transport, planning, and coordinated labor at a time when pottery had not yet become part of local life. The wall and ditch have often been described as fortifications. That remains possible, but other interpretations connect them with flood control, social display, territorial identity, or several functions combined. Architecture rarely belongs to only one category. The settlement drew strength from water. In an arid valley, a dependable spring allowed repeated cultivation and residence. People grew crops, stored food, built round and later rectangular structures, and buried their dead within the living settlement. Over time, plastered skulls appeared, faces modeled over ancestral remains, with shells sometimes placed in the eyes. The practice suggests that memory was not left in a distant cemetery. It was rebuilt inside the community. Jericho is frequently called the oldest city in the world. That phrase is memorable, but hides a scholarly problem. City implies more than age or density. It can imply government, occupational specialization, public institutions, and relationships with a hinterland. Early Jericho was unquestionably a large permanent settlement with monumental communal works. Whether its earliest phase should be labeled a city depends on the definition being used. The tower has also attracted astronomical interpretations. One study proposed that its stairway and position related to the setting sun at the summer solstice and the nearby mountain. This is a documented hypothesis, not a universally accepted fact. The tower could have carried several meanings, and its builders left no text explaining them. Jericho's history was not a single, unbroken climb from village to city. The mound records abandonment, rebuilding, new populations, and later Bronze Age urban life. Walls from different periods are easily collapsed into one story, especially through biblical associations. The famous Neolithic tower predates the biblical narratives by thousands of years and cannot be used as direct evidence for them. What it proves is already astonishing. More than 10,000 years ago, a community beside a spring gathered enough labor to alter the edge of its settlement with stone on a monumental scale. The staircase climbs inside the tower but ends beneath open sky, leading toward a purpose history never wrote down. Number 2. Caral Supe. On a desert terrace above Peru's Supe Valley, monumental mounds and sunken circular courts rise where the green ribbon of the river meets one of the driest landscapes on Earth. Systematic archaeological work demonstrated that Caral belonged to the late Archaic period, flourishing roughly 5,000 years ago. UNESCO describes it as the oldest known center of civilization in the Americas. Caral was not alone. More than a dozen major sites in the Supe region formed part of a wider social system often called the Norte Chico or Caral Supe civilization. At Caral itself, monumental platform mounds, plazas, residential sectors, and carefully organized space reveal sustained planning. Builders filled woven fiber bags with stone and used them inside construction, creating a labor system that could expand structures over repeated phases. The economy joined coast and valley. Farmers produced cotton used for fishing nets, while coastal communities supplied marine protein. Irrigated crops, plant foods, craft production, and exchange allowed populations to thrive without the pottery, abundant figurative art, or written records that archaeologists often expect from early civilization. Quipu-like knotted cords reported from the site are intriguing, but claims that they functioned exactly like the later Inca recording system remain uncertain. Music again appears in the archaeological record. Flutes made from bird bone and other instruments were found in ceremonial contexts. Their presence suggests gatherings in which sound, procession, and architecture worked together. Fire altars and repeated building phases indicate ritual practices tied to public space. Yet there is limited evidence of the defensive walls, mass warfare, or royal burials familiar from some other early states. Caral's age initially faced skepticism because its monumental form looked younger than the radiocarbon dates implied. Dating of plant material and woven bags established construction during the 3rd millennium BCE, contemporary with early pyramid building in Egypt. This was not influence carried across the Atlantic. The Andean system arose through local processes adapted to Pacific fisheries, river valleys, irrigation, cotton, and exchange. What Caral's leaders or organizers called themselves is unknown. There is no readable royal list. Even the degree of centralized authority remains debated. Monumental construction proves coordination, but coordination can emerge through religious obligation, reciprocal labor, hierarchy, persuasion, or combinations that leave similar architecture behind. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the center declined as regional patterns shifted, and environmental disruptions may have contributed. Andean civilization did not end. New centers and traditions developed. Caral's plazas fell silent, then desert dryness protected fragments of fiber that normally disappear. In those woven bags of stone, the first great architectural tradition of the Americas left its fingerprints. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, earlier surveyors recorded worked stone but did not recognize the full age of the mound. In the 1990s, excavations directed by Klaus Schmidt exposed enormous T-shaped pillars arranged in circular and oval enclosures. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological context placed the major monumental phases between approximately 9600 and 8200 BCE. The site was older than Stonehenge by many millennia and stood near the beginning of the Neolithic transformation. The pillars are carved with foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, and other animals. Some central pillars carry arms, hands, belts, and garments, showing that the T-forms were probably stylized beings rather than simple supports. They stand within carefully built enclosures whose benches, walls, floors, and repeated rebuilding required quarrying, design, food, skilled labor, and shared purpose. The first interpretation presented Göbekli Tepe as a temple built by nomadic hunter-gatherers before settled life and agriculture. That image remains powerful, but has become too simple. Evidence from the site and the broader Taş-Tepeler region reveals domestic activity, food processing, nearby settlements, and communities already moving through stages of cultivation and sedentism. Wild cereals grew in the region, and early domestication unfolded across Upper Mesopotamia. Monument and settlement were not opposing worlds. They developed together. Nor was Göbekli Tepe a lonely miracle. Karahan Tepe and other sites demonstrate a regional tradition of monumental architecture. This removes none of Göbekli Tepe's importance. It replaces the fantasy of one inexplicable sanctuary with something more historically meaningful. Networks of communities sharing symbols, techniques, gatherings, and perhaps rivalries across a changing landscape. Animal bones indicate large-scale consumption, particularly of wild species. Feasting may have helped mobilize labor and bind groups together, but claims that beer alone built the monuments remain speculative. So do efforts to identify every carved animal as a constellation, or to read the site as a record of a comet impact. Researchers debate imagery, ritual, memory, death, and social identity. There is no accepted translation of the carvings because they are not a deciphered text. The enclosures were modified, filled, and replaced over time. Earlier accounts emphasized deliberate burial of the entire site. More recent work treats the mound's formation as a complex process involving construction debris, occupation, rebuilding, and intentional deposition rather than one final ceremonial burial. Archaeology advances precisely by revising its own dramatic stories. Göbekli Tepe changed prehistory because it made collective imagination visible at extraordinary depth. Monumental architecture did not wait for kings, cities, or writing. Large gatherings and shared ritual may have helped create the social conditions in which cultivation, residence, and new forms of authority intensified. Religion did not simply appear after surplus. Symbolic labor and subsistence transformation were entangled from the beginning. Look back across the countdown and another pattern emerges. The oldest sites are not incomplete versions of ourselves. Their people solve different problems. At Sanai Maruyama, a managed forest and seasonal abundance supported permanence, without fields becoming the sole foundation of life. At Jiahu, a community used sound, fermentation, symbols, and burial to make social experience durable. On Malta, isolated islanders transformed limited stone and labor into a ceremonial tradition lasting many centuries. Each case warns us against using one checklist to decide when complexity begins. The objects also reveal the technologies that ordinary histories overlook. A bone flute required knowledge of anatomy, drilling, spacing, breadth, and pitch. Lime plaster required fuel, controlled heat, water, timing, and practiced hands. A polished axe carried the work of quarrying, grinding, hafting, and repair. Woven fibers held Caral's construction fill together, even though cloth and cord usually rot before archaeologists arrive. The prehistoric world was filled with wood, hide fiber, song, gesture, and spoken memory. Stone survives disproportionately, so stone can deceive us into imagining that it was all they knew. Scale is equally deceptive. A large footprint does not automatically prove a permanently crowded city. At Trypillia, thousands of mapped houses raise questions about simultaneous occupation and seasonal gathering. At Ain Ghazal, population estimates change when researchers alter assumptions about household size and occupied area. Archaeology has no census clerk waiting beneath the soil. It builds ranges from foundations, food, water, refuse, and comparison. The responsible question is not which dramatic number sounds best, but which forms of cooperation the evidence requires even at the lowest defensible estimate. The same caution applies to power. Varna's unequal graves strongly indicate social differentiation, but a rich burial does not identify a king. Caral's monuments demonstrate organization, but they do not reveal whether labor was demanded by rulers, exchanged through reciprocal obligation, inspired by religion, or coordinated through several systems at once. Çatalhöyük lacks a palace, yet some houses accumulated deeper histories than others. Power can live in offices, families, ritual knowledge, access to exchange, or the authority to organize a feast. It does not always leave a throne. Then there is writing, the boundary that creates prehistory itself. The Vinci signs and Jiahu marks remind us that communication has many layers. A potter's sign can preserve identity without recording a sentence. A repeated symbol can organize a ritual without representing spoken grammar. Knots can count, images can recall stories, and architecture can guide behavior. When archaeologists refuse to call every mark writing, they are not diminishing prehistoric intelligence. They are protecting the difference between a visible symbol and a recoverable language. Environment shaped every community without mechanically controlling it. Nabta Playa depended on rainfall patterns but responded with wells, mobility, gathering, and memory. Jericho turned a spring into the anchor of long settlement. Malta's communities built within strict island limits. Caral connected irrigated valleys with the Pacific coast. Climate created pressures and opportunities, but people chose among them. A drought does not topple every society in the same way. Its impact depends on storage, politics, exchange, inequality, and the ability to move. This is why disappearance must be handled carefully. An archaeological culture can end while descendants continue living under new material traditions. A settlement can be abandoned without its population dying. A ceremonial center can fall silent because roots, alliances, or beliefs changed. The urge to end every chapter with invasion, eruption, or apocalypse produces clean stories but inaccurate history. Most prehistoric endings were transformations distributed across generations, visible only as thinning occupation, altered pottery, new diets, or houses no longer rebuilt. And this is the pattern connecting all 12 worlds. Sinai Maruyama shows settled complexity without full agriculture. Jiahu preserves music without notation. Malta reveals monumental tradition without a written plan. Varna makes hierarchy visible without a royal title. Vinci marks clay without leaving readable sentences. Trypillia assembles populations without an obvious palace. Nabta builds sacred geography without permanent streets. Çatalhöyük turns houses into tombs and archives. Ain Ghazal creates faces without names. Jericho raises a tower before pottery. Caral organizes a civilization without the technologies once assumed necessary. Göbekli Tepe places monuments near the threshold, where foraging, cultivation, settlement, and ritual were transforming one another. There is also a final lesson in the map. These sites extend from Japan and China through the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, North Africa, Mediterranean islands, Eastern Europe, and the Peruvian coast. Their timelines overlap unevenly, and most were not in contact with one another. Similar human challenges produced different solutions: storage pits and raised granaries, roof streets and circular courts, mobile gatherings and permanent towers, carved pillars and plaster ancestors. Convergence does not require a forgotten master culture carrying one blueprint around the planet. It reveals that human beings repeatedly discovered how to organize labor, material, belief, and landscape under radically different conditions. That insight changes how we view the anonymous dead. They were not waiting passively for history to begin in Sumer or Egypt. They were already debating through action: where to place a house, who could enter a ceremony, how food should be shared, which dead should remain beneath the floor, and what symbols deserve to outlive their makers. We cannot hear their arguments, but archaeology recovers their consequences. Every rebuilt wall is a decision repeated. Every abandoned monument is a decision that finally stopped being repeated. None proves a vanished, global supercivilization. None needs one. The evidence is more radical than that idea because it reveals many independent routes toward complexity. Civilization was not invented once as a complete package. It emerged through experiments in storage, ceremony, trade, ancestry, food, inequality, cooperation, and memory. Some experiments produced states. Others ended, dispersed, or became foundations for worlds that followed. Writing eventually allowed rulers and institutions to speak across time. Prehistory speaks differently. It speaks through a cranebone flute, a plaster face, a burned house, a post hole, a woven bag filled with stone, and the shadow of a pillar carved with animals no one can name. Those fragments survive by accident as much as intention. Fire hardens clay while consuming roofs. Desert preserves fiber while forests erase timber. Burial protects gold while everyday tools are worn down and recycled. The archaeological record is therefore not a complete portrait. It is a damaged archive shaped by chemistry, weather, human choices, and excavation. Every conclusion must remain open to the next trench, the next radiocarbon date, or the next object recovered from beneath a road. If one of these places deserves its own full documentary, tell us which one in the comments. Subscribe for more journeys into the evidence buried before history began, and choose the next video on screen to continue into the forgotten worlds of the ancient past.